Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's episode is a recording of the conversation that I had with the author and journalist James Marriott at the Regent Street Cinema in London. In front of a live audience, we were discussing James's favourite film. It is Whit Stillman's Metropolitan. It's a film about being young and feeling old. It's a film about money and class, about love and hate, but it's also a film about books and a great film of ideas. As always with these episodes recorded at the Regent Street Cinema, we are very conscious that the audience have just seen the film that we're discussing, but people listening will not just have seen the film that we're discussing, and in fact, many people will never have seen the film at all. So I want to say just a little bit about Whit Stillman's Metropolitan, just a bit about what's in it, the story, and some of the themes, so that you know what James and I are discussing. It was released in 1990. It's ostensibly set around then, I guess in the late 80s, but as you'll hear, it's not completely clear that that is when it's set. There's something vague about the historical timing of this film. It feels earlier. It feels maybe more like the 70s, maybe even earlier than that. It tells the story of a group of young, well-to-do New Yorkers during party season, Christmas party season, but these are not ordinary parties. These are debutante balls that take place at fancy New York hotels and involve dressing up in tuxedos and tailcoats and even top hats, and the women in ball gowns. But the action doesn't really take place at these balls. This is a film about the after parties, the before and the after parties. It focuses on a group who call themselves the Sally Fowler Rat Pack. Sally Fowler is one of the characters, and they meet in her apartment, or rather, I should say, in her wealthy parents' apartment. And they hang out after these balls and they talk. A lot of this film is talk. They talk about love and sex and money and art and socialism and novels and Jane Austen. And they talk a lot about class and who they think they are. Into their world, at the start of the film, comes someone who seems like he might be an outsider, an interloper even. He's called Tom Townsend, and he seems to be different from the others. He's poorer. It's all relative, but he's not as well off. And he seems more cynical. He's not really into these balls. But that turns out not quite to be right. He is ambivalent about them, but he plays his part. And actually, he gets drawn in. He becomes quite happily a member of the Sally Fowler Rat Pack. And even his status, his wealth, is only just below theirs. We see him in his apartment with his mother. It's clear his parents have got divorced and his mother got the rum end of that deal. But it's also clear, we discover later on in the film, that his stepmother stole his trust fund. So he's not really an outsider. He becomes friends with particularly the men in the group. Frenemies, I would say. One of them, Charlie, who is the nerdy, bookish, really talky, ideas-based one, also completely lovelorn. In the group, it's a relative term again, but the alpha male is someone called Nick, but Nick also turns out to be pretty brittle. And the film focuses among the women on one young woman in particular. Her name is Audrey, and she is shyer than the others. She's more modest seeming, a little more uneasy, and she is in love with Tom. And that is the engine that drives the plot, such as it is. There is a bit of a will they, won't they get together aspect to this film, but that isn't really what drives the watching experience, because most of this film is just talk between this group, the members of this group, about the things that they're interested in, their worries, their fears. Some of it is about love and sex. They play strip poker. They drink a lot. One of them has to give up drink. He drinks too much. But they talk very seriously about books and ideas, and they are also obsessed with class, and in particular, the question of their own class. One of them, the nerdy, bookish Charlie, comes up with a term for the class that he thinks they belong to. UHB, for short. It stands for urban haute bourgeoisie, because he thinks that the terms that are usually used for people like them, preppy or WASP, aren't accurate enough, and they aren't really serious enough. As he says at one point, you can't be a preppy when you're 70 years old, but people like us live to be 70 years old, so what are we? We're UBs. We're the UHBs, we're the urban haute bourgeoisie. And the theme of the film, and the theme of a lot of their chat, is that they belong to a class, a world, that is in decline. It's on the way out. Where are we? The late 80s? Or is it the 70s? Or is it earlier than that? It doesn't really matter, because people from that class, by implication, have felt for a long time that history is catching up with them, with their ways of being, not just with their money, but with their manners, with their parties, with their style. They are out of time. These are young people out of time, and they're very conscious of it. And they want to know what's coming next. They talk about the world around them. They are somewhat bemused by it in various ways, as well as being extremely aloof from it. And they worry, and this is a film about their anxieties too. But above all, these are young people who don't know where they belong. And that is part of what we're talking about. Here's the conversation. That film, Metropolitan, came out in 1990. I first saw it the year it came out. I was a student. I'm not giving anything away when I say James hadn't been born then. But you have written that it's your favourite film. So the first thing I want to know is, when did you first see it and how old were you?
I sort of feel like I should have some origin story that I saw it when I was a student. I only saw it for the first time a couple of years ago. I'd avoided it because people kept telling me that I would love it. And you know, when people say that you're going to love something and then you become offended by the idea that they understand what you would love, and everybody said, this is the film that you will love, it's made for you. And I said, that's preposterous. But then eventually enough people told me I'd love it. And I watched it and I was completely transported by it. And I think I loved it so much because there's a sort of feeling you get when you discover films or books or music when you're, I guess, the age of the characters in the films are, and then that you get that less and less often as you get older. But I felt I felt a bit way about that film when I saw it a couple of years ago, and it was lovely to have that feeling again, which is rarer as you get older.
So when I saw it, it's set in a kind of preppy New York scene, but it was 1990. I was that sort of age in 1990. So this was an interesting, somewhat exotic world, but it wasn't another time for me. I mean, these people weren't living lives that were remote from mine. Any film from the 1990s that you watch now, if you first saw it 2 years ago, the first thing that you notice is that it feels like the 1890s, because they're reading books, they don't have phones, they're writing each other letters. With this one, it's a bit more complicated because in some ways it's also trying, even from 1990, to give the feeling that it comes from another age. But when you saw it, did it feel like it came from a completely other world?
Yeah, it did. I think that's partly I think the timelessness is one of the great things about it. I think when Whit Stillman talks about making it, he says that he wanted to make a film about his own youth, and he was born in the mid-50s. And I think he was of that age in that scene in the early 70s, but he lacked the budget to make a film set in the past. So they had to kind of go for a slightly ambiguous, filming it in, I guess, late 1980s New York, but trying to give the atmosphere of a time that was a bit earlier, because I don't think things like the Deb scene and wasps walking around New York in top hats really existed in the late 80s. But I think the timelessness of that film is one of the things that really works about it. I think if it was, because although there's obviously a sort of social anxiety about the downward social mobility of the class, I think if it leant too hard on those social and political themes, it would feel a bit much. But the sort of odd, hard to place in time, slightly mythologized, I guess maybe the slight kind of timelessness that you feel about your own youth when you look back at being young, it has this sort of slightly timeless, unplaceable quality. And I think the film captures all those things very well.
The opening credits, the first thing that you get is a kind of Regency soundtrack that lasts for about 10 seconds. And then the credits seem like an homage to Woody Allen. So it's like those Woody Allen credits. And then you get a film which in some ways is Jane Austen meets Woody Allen, or that's how it kind of seems to me. Do you think that's right? It's a Jane Austen Woody Allen mashup?
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And it seems right from everything you know about Whit Stillman's influences. Weirdly, the first piece of music you hear, this is a sign that I have been doing my research, Whit Stillman says is an arrangement of the hymn "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." And he thinks there's some sort of religious theme going through the film, which I can't really particularly make out, but apparently is there to be looked out for.
Although Charlie is talking about, the first thing we hear Charlie say is talking about God.
Is about God, but I'm not particularly...
But he doesn't come back to it.
And I'm not convinced it particularly means anything in the film. I don't know. Whit Stillman always talks about his love of Jane Austen, his love of F. Scott Fitzgerald, his love of, I think, the 18th century in general, talks about like Samuel Johnson. I also heard him on a podcast, and I have listened to a lot of Whit Stillman podcasts, of him talking about people like Thomas Love Peacock. So I think the sort of the 18th century vibe of wit and also the kind of slight moralism, the kind of Jane Austen moralism you get, I think runs through that film as well. I mean, I can't say that I've seen an awful lot of Woody Allen films, finding Whit Stillman much funnier. But I don't know, where do you think the Woody Allen...
So there are moments when Charlie is talking, and I mean Charlie in particular. Charlie is the intellectual one, if you
yes,
remember.
He's very sort of Woody Allen.
He's more of a Woody Allen character. I mean, the Jane Austen theme, in a way, it's obvious they talk a lot about Jane Austen. They particularly talk about Mansfield Park. I seem to remember after I saw this film in 1990, I went and read Mansfield Park and was determined to make it my favourite Jane Austen novel, and that I was going to like Fanny Price come what may. It's not Clueless in the sense it's not a modern American take on a specific novel, but clearly Audrey is in some ways meant to be a Fanny Price character.
Yes. And I mean, the density of the dialogue feels very novelistic. And even watching it again there, I was realizing there were brilliant lines that are almost thrown away by the actors, and you have to sort of watch it 7 times to realize every single little... People will say something, the scene will immediately cut, and you've just completely missed it. And I think that density feels very novelistic.
Like when Tom Townsend leaves the apartment for the first time and Sally Fowler says, "Good luck with the Fourierism."
Exactly. And you can just... There's so many little things like that you could just completely lose, but I think would probably stand out more at the end of a chapter of a book, I suppose. And I wonder if there's a bit of a sort of written as much like a novel as a film in some ways. The other kind of Jane Austen analogy is that social world, which has lots of rules which have to be obeyed, and people are going to dances. And I almost wonder if is that the last time in history that you could conceivably set a kind of Jane Austen style social world. I don't know what other milieu you could use to recreate that convincingly after the sort of debutante class falls apart, that highly rule-based, class-based social world. And maybe that's the last time that you can do proper kind of Jane Austen social etiquette comedy.
And yet there is Clueless. And Clueless it's later than this film. I'm not sure what year Clueless was made. It's LA, it's high school, but the recurring joke is that an LA high school has as much hierarchy, class, rules of etiquette. There's something about Jane Austen. I mean, the thing that makes this different is it's not just you can tell a story in which there's hierarchy and etiquette, but they're talking like it's 200 years ago. I mean, these people are living it out in a way that the Clueless characters aren't. They are actually cosplaying a kind of Jane Austen world.
Yes, and it's very overt. And I mean, it's impossible to know because we weren't part of the 1970s New York debutante scene, but was it like that? Were they all constantly wearing their top hats and talking about the correct etiquette and how annoying it was that the European aristocracy looked down on you? I mean, I suspect it's sort of the levels of mythology that are in the film. You know, I don't know how many there are, but it's sort of technically set in the late 80s, but it's actually set in the early 70s. But it's a sort of fantasy from the early 70s about an earlier time.
Of the 50s. Of the 50s looking back to the...
Exactly. And then F. Scott Fitzgerald's there somehow. But I think all that, it sort of works. It sort of sounds like if you try to explain it and you were pitching this film and you were going to say, well, it's not quite the 70s or the 50s, or it would sound awful, but it kind of works. It gives it all a kind of weird sort of timelessness, which I think is hard to bring off in a film. I was trying to think of other things that have that timeless quality. It reminds me a little bit of the way that in the P.G. Wodehouse books, the Jeeves books, they're kind of set in like an eternal, unchanging upper class world. I think P.G. Wodehouse was publishing Jeeves books until like the 60s. But they still go around in their spats and they still live in this totally kind of removed pastoral version of upper class life. The other film that slightly reminds me of, which I think also successfully is ambiguous about when it's set, is the Alan Bennett play and then film The History Boys, which is technically set in the 1980s, but is clearly about Alan Bennett's 1950s grammar school experience. And somehow it's the kind of thing that really shouldn't work in a film, because a film has to be so constantly visually specific and you're constantly giving people visual clues about class and about time, and you have to film the streets and stuff. But it's sort of oddly does work. And that's another film that's about a very similar time of youth and a very kind of, maybe it's that particular timelessness that works well together, but it is weirdly successful. It didn't even strike me the first time I saw it that there wasn't ambiguity about when it was set. I was just sort of vaguely thought, oh yeah, that must have been what New York was like in the early 1990s. I mean, I wasn't around to witness it, but maybe they were. And then you see it again and you're like, hang on, top hats in the 80s thing?
Yeah, I mean, I watch it now and think that must be what it was like, and I was alive then. More than the top hats, more than the dinner jackets, the thing that really stands out for me is when Tom and Charlie are kind of no longer going to the parties and they're going upstate to rescue the girl, and like they're rolling their sleeves up and the romance is going to take off. They still wear ties in every single scene. They are never seen without a tie on, except when you see him in his pajamas getting up at 5 PM. And that, to me, I mean, I do remember enough of what 1990 was like. People were not wearing ties off duty.
And especially someone like Tom, whose entire shtick is that he despises the social world of people who do wear ties. And
so when he takes the bus, he wears a tie.
Yeah, but I mean, all those, it's a mark that Whit Stillman has created his own artistic world, which has its own internal logic, and it doesn't particularly have to relate to reality. And in the last days of disco, film about clubbing, everyone's wearing ties in a club, and you're like, again, when I saw that film for the first time, it didn't particularly strike me that was weird, because I guess that's the kind of successful artistic creation that just works on its own terms, and it's kind of why it's so enchanting. And one of the things that I've heard Whit Stillman say about it is that he was nervous making it because he felt like the social milieu would be so off-putting to an audience, because if you make a film about a load of incredibly posh people going to parties and not having jobs, you expect the audience to despise those people. And he was talking about how he was struggling to think of a means of giving the audience a way in. And actually, I'm not sure you particularly... I think it's so enchanted and so mythologized. I don't think you do need showing into that world. I think you sort of accept it as a separate thing. But I mean, that again could be a slightly generational thing, because certainly, I mean, if it is set in the early 1970s and they have this kind of sense of like the decline of their class, I think perhaps we just are not in touch with a lot of the animus towards WASPs that existed in like the 60s and 70s, and a lot of the kind of real dislike and fed upness with the society moved on and became frustrated with this old elite. So we might just be removed from those emotions and we can't feel them anymore. But
yeah, because at the start of the film, it feels like and it looks like Tom is going to be a different character than he turns out to be, and that it looks like somehow they've stumbled across this poor person who they're going to bring into their world. And then it's weird because you discover that he's one of the boyfriends of the girl who has 20 boyfriends. And then you can't really place him. It turns out it's a story of divorce. It's a story, as we'll talk about in a minute, of possible downward mobility. But it's downwardly mobile in the sense that his stepmother has stolen his trust fund. And Tom is completely comfortable in that world. I mean, the odd thing about it is he poses as a Fourierist and he rejects the parties. But at the beginning, it looks like he's going to be our way in because he's going to be the everyman who stumbled into this world. No, he isn't. He's just like them.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the brilliant things about a film that is so subtle and unexpected in so many ways. And it's such a cliche of a film that's trying to show you an inaccessible upper class milieu to give you the everyman character to identify with. And as you say, I think Whit Stillman has said that's how the character of Tom started out. And then he became complicated. And I think it's just so interesting and so kind of artistically unusual that the everyman character who takes you into the world is also a slightly dislikable person. And when you're inside the world, you suddenly start sympathizing with them more than the person who's taken you in there. But then I think by the end, he's become a little more sympathetic again. And I think the way it plays with your sympathies is like so subtle. And again, it's one of those things that you don't particularly notice. On the first time I saw it, I think I vaguely found Tom the kind of relatable character. And then you see it again and you begin to understand that he really does treat Audrey very badly, and that the more times I see it, the more you kind of feel like she's the sort of center of the film.
One of the ways it reminds me of a Woody Allen film is Woody Allen films often look like he wishes he were making a European film, a French film or a Bergman film or something. And it's all set up to be a European film, and these are going to be serious people talking about big ideas, but they can't escape the fact that they're neurotic New Yorkers. And so it's like a European film in which people are trapped in this neurotic New York identity. They wish they were in a Truffaut film, but unfortunately they're stuck in a Woody Allen film. And this reminded me of that a little too. I mean, they talk like they aspire to be, in some sense, European intellectuals, and yet they are completely trapped by their Americanness. And one of the ways they're trapped by their Americanness, one of the things I often think about French movies which are about young people sort of experimenting with life, talking about big ideas, is that not only in the film does it seem like they don't have parents, but they never talk about their parents. If you ever see any of those French movies, the point about the young people is that they are reinventing what it is to be young. These people are obsessed with their parents. They talk about nothing but their parents. They're obsessed with their class. They're completely self-conscious. They're obsessed with their place in the social hierarchy. And they're obsessed with downward mobility. None of that happens in a French film of the 60s or 70s, in which the point is that to be young is to be capable of describing a new world. I think on the poster for this movie, the tagline, it's not "in space, no one can hear you scream." The tagline for this film is, "At last, a movie about downward mobility," which it is. And yet, this is one of the weird things about the time in which it's set. So if we take it literally, it's set at the end of the 80s. Here's a group of waspy, preppy, privileged kids from fancy schools and fancy colleges fearing that their privilege is coming to an end. Oh, no, it wasn't. This is 1990. This is the dawn of the great boom. The idea that these people are somehow on the edge of some decline in which, in America, their class is going to be dragged down. They're all doomed to failure. So when I watch it now, that's the bit of it that strikes me as weirdly, quaintly dated, that there they are in 1990. At one point, they talk about how it's all over, their way of life is all over. And one of them says, why? And the answer is, because of everything that's going on. What everything? Well, the economy and the stock market. It's all about to boom, and you lot are all about to get much, much richer. That's the bit that makes it feel to me like it comes from another world.
Yeah, and I was sort of thinking, when you talk about that, it must have played very oddly in my somewhat idealized idea of what the 1990s was like. I can't imagine that it felt like downward mobility in the 1990s particularly. As we were saying before, in some ways it's kind of more resonant today because the theme of middle class downward mobility and urban middle class downwardly mobile artistic types is like a very prominent cultural theme. Especially if you're looking at contemporary novels. Or
as you say, from the 1970s.
Or
so
from
it makes sense in the 70s.
Yes.
It makes sense in the 2020s, just not the 1990s.
Exactly. It's the kind of, poor Whit Stillman, perhaps this was a bad time for his film to come out because he was sort of completely against the social trends. But if it's the early 70s, this is the rise of meritocracy. There was a sort of big social panic in America in the 60s, I think, wasn't there, about this fear that America was going to end up with a kind of calcified European-style upper class that was going to manage it into decline while the Soviet Union was building Sputnik and having kind of a successful meritocracy of scientists. Obviously none of that happened, but there was a huge push in American universities and Harvard and Yale that I think really kicked in the 60s to meritocratically select candidates. The arrival of the SATs. You had all these polemics against the calcified upper class. Is it the time that Richard Hofstadter book about American anti-intellectualism comes out, and there's a real fear that America is just going to end up with this lunk-headed Philistine European-style aristocracy, and all the universities reform. And that must have felt so much in the air for Whit Stillman in his youth, in the 70s, having come from that background. I think his parents were prominent WASPs. His dad worked for JFK or something. And this probably was what he was living. And of course, as you say, it wasn't that they were going to be economically downwardly mobile. It's that their class signifiers were just all about to vanish and disappear and become irrelevant.
Exactly. The thing that's under threat here are the manners. The manners are under threat, but that scene in the bar where they talk, there's almost my favorite character, that slightly blank-looking guy who talks about the fact that he's a failure. We're not all doomed, but it's terrible being us because you're always meeting people more successful than you are. And Charlie says, and for those of you who haven't failed yet, the failure is still to come. But the idea also that there is a kind of genuine meritocratic tide that's rising, and their privilege is going to be swept away because their privilege is based on old money and family and connections, and talent is somehow going to sweep them away. Oh, no, it wasn't. We now live in a world where we know that actually what passes for meritocracy is all about connections and credentialism and privilege. And this class entrenched its privilege from this point on pretty much through to now, not quite maybe through to now. Maybe it resonates now because actually it's more relevant now. But you look at those kids and you think no, you're all going to be fine.
You're
I
going
mean,
to be
don't you think?
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
So what do you think happens to them? I mean, so let's say it is 1990, not 1970.
Yeah.
Where do they go? How do you picture them as they age over the next 50 years? So the thing that I don't see for them, I mean, maybe for Nick, there's drug addiction, I don't know. But what I don't see is financial and social failure for any of them.
No, not at all. I mean, you kind of think that some of them are probably going to have to put on a pair of jeans at some point and like slightly get with the approaching 21st century. I mean, the political thing is really interesting, and the idea of a kind of slightly old-fashioned conservative group of young people probably felt weird in the 90s and not particularly realistic in the 90s. None of them are conservatives now. I mean, if they were young now, they wouldn't be conservatives. I can believe if they were old, they still might be.
I think they would all end up as never Trumpers.
Exactly.
That's the sort of journey they would take. These people they don't seem to be questioning the values of the families and the culture that they grew up in. So I'm guessing they're kind of basically Reaganites. They're sort of conservatives, but they're conservatives who also are interested in the signifiers of class. So for them, the Bush years would probably be okay. The Obama years would probably be okay. The Trump years would be a nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. And I think the proof of this is if you follow Whit Stillman on Twitter, as I do, there is a lot of infuriated tweeting about Donald Trump, which is precisely what you could imagine Charlie or Nick might be doing from whatever, lovely country home they're sitting in, just furiously tweeting about Donald Trump themselves. I think the other interesting question is to imagine who are those people now? What would that film look like if it was set in 2020 or 2015? I'm rewatching Lena Dunham's Girls at the moment. I mean, that's another brilliantly witty TV series about artistically minded, upper middle class people with wealthy parents. And they're all obviously liberals. And one of the jokes in Girls is that Hannah, the main character, briefly has a sort of Republican boyfriend. And this is like absolute horror. If they were young now, they would all be Democrat liberals. I think with the possible exception of Tom, who in a spirit of contrarianism might be a sort of edgy, what do they call it, dime square conservative.
He'd find something on the manosphere.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
And it wouldn't be Fourierism. I don't think Fourierism is big on the manosphere.
I think that's exactly where he'd be. The other thing that this sort of cultural change reminds me of is that sort of self-conscious, proud elitism is something that has completely disappeared. And rewatching it, I was thinking of, did you read this book that came out a couple of years ago called Born to Rule by the sociologists Sam Friedman and Aaron Reeves? And they were tracking, it's very relevant to this film because they track the development of elite culture over the last 100 years, quite cleverly using people's professed interests and cultural interests in Who's Who. So you can take the elite slice of society and see what they say they like doing. And it sort of goes through the early part of the 20th century. It goes like Chinese porcelain, poetry, Jane Austen, walking around Venice. And then by the time you get to the sort of 70s and 80s, it's becoming watching the football, television, and much more self-consciously relatable cultural signifiers. And the thesis of this book is that in a society that is at least ideologically meritocratic, you have to adopt ordinary man signifiers because the signal you're trying to send socially is I'm just an ordinary person who happens to have got to the top through my hard work, rather than, ballet, opera, porcelain, which says I've inherited all my cultural and social privilege. And that sort of self-conscious elitism don't think it exists like anywhere I can't imagine really where that exists culturally now.
And as you say, given that was already happening in the 70s and 80s, that's one of the ways in which this film feels out of time as well as timeless. Another feature of it that makes it feel to me different from what that generation, it's not my generation, it's more like your generation, but you can tell me if I'm wrong, what that generation might feel now, is they're obsessed with being at the end of something, but there's a sort of series of connections. We're the worst generation since the Reformation kind of talk. I don't know if that's what the young people are saying now, but it feels to me, so there's a lot of, we're the last people to do this. We're going to be the last people to do this or this or this. If you live in 2026 and you're a young person, aren't you more likely to think we're the first people to experience this or this or this? So we're on the cusp of something new. There's a sort of rupture. There's more of a feeling now that the relationship to the past is that we are going through or possibly soon to be on the other side of some kind of rupture. So whether it's AI or something else, but that long historical chain that connects us to the deep past, we're no longer part of it. Whereas for these people, their whole frame of reference is a series of connections back through generations. And again, to me, that makes it feel almost more 19th century than 21st century.
I think in some ways that's true. I think in other ways, I can't claim to be particularly young anymore, but if you were to compare it, I think that sense of like belatedness and coming at the end of something is certainly quite common. When you were talking, it reminds me of, I think there's films that have a lot in common with the novels of Sally Rooney, which are again a series of something else I love about pretentious young people talking nonsense to each other at parties.
And you're not quite going to get Fourierism in them, but you do get Marxism.
Exactly. You get Marxism and you get people sort of saying slightly vapid things about the Middle East, which is part of the overlooked comedy of the Sally Rooney books, I think. But there's a line in one of the Sally Rooney books where one of the characters says, we're standing in the last lighted room before the dark. Like we're coming at the end of this long sort of 20th century of prosperity and upward mobility, and we're the last people, and we're watching it all fall apart in front of our eyes. And that seems very much in tune with the mood of Metropolitan. And when I went to see Last Days of Disco, another great Whit Stillman film at the ICA last year, that was like full of people who were younger than me. So maybe they're sort of feeling a connection with that sort of sense of belatedness and coming at the end of something, and having grown up with an idea of a world that you're going to join, and you understood all its manners and its rules, and you understood what kinds of people the political class would be composed of, and then all that sort of just falls apart in front of your eyes. And maybe people who are in their like 20s feel like that now. I think people my generation certainly feel like that the world we assumed we would join and the rules that we assumed we would play by have all sort of just been scrambled and seem incomprehensible.
But again, the difference would be this little group of people are talking about the rules of their little group of people, and what they see is other people they assume who are going to be fine playing by their rules. And it does feel now a little bit more like if this is the light before the dark is something broader than that. It's not like there aren't going to be any jobs for our little UHB clan. There aren't going to be any jobs. It's closer to something a little more apocalyptic. Maybe the religious theme in this that we were meant to get is actually these 8 or so people represent something about the universal human experience. But the way they talk, their problem is that they're ubs.
Yeah, exactly. And Charlie's theory of downward mobility, which seems like absurd pessimism in that film, is the kind of thing that probably seems like completely realistic about the prospects of middle-class people, or certainly, they're
middle-class educated, so not that narrow.
But they probably have property, so they're fine. And if they're around now, they're probably not going to be too worried. But I think that feeling of doomed middle-classness seems very kind of resonant. And I assume this was kind of what was speaking to me, the really surprisingly young audience who turned out to see that film last year, because it's very much in the air. But as you say, in the 70s, like, what was the future? Sort of yuppies, that David Brooks phrase, bobos. They were all going to become bobos and sort of have more individualistic values and buy expensive yogurt and work for software companies and slightly hide the fact that they all came from posh families and be embarrassed they'd ever talked about whose mum was who. And they're all going to be completely okay, as you say, but it doesn't look so okay nowadays.
Urban haute bourgeoisie. Do you think Whit Stillman, is it simply a kind of parody term? Is it a satire? Or is there a hint in there that he thinks it's actually quite a useful piece of sociological analysis? I couldn't tell. It's clearly funny. People laugh. And there's that great moment in the scene in the bar with my favorite character where he hears it and then he sort of adopts it with a slightly puzzled look. How you say up? Do you think he's actually trying to carve out an identity for a specific group, or is it just parody?
I think it's both, but I think there is clearly a useful purpose for that phrase, because, when you read all the criticisms of America's WASP class, the criticisms were not, these are intellectuals who are sitting around talking about Jane Austen. It was like, these are lunk-headed Philistines who can't get with the program, who have no intellectual interests, who, go to Yale and Harvard and never, ever, ever talk about anything that they've learned, and they just go and, drink and play. I don't know what the American upper class equivalent of like cricket is, but they're sort of completely wasting their time. And these are not the thoughtful, intellectual people we want for our society. But that doesn't at all describe the characters of Metropolitan.
No, except for von Slonaker's rowing friend.
Yes, exactly, yeah. And possibly von Slonaker himself. But I suppose he's trying to carve out, its sociological use may just extend to people who were friends with Whit Stillman in the early 1970s, who came from vaguely patrician backgrounds, but were a bit bohemian.
And like talking about books.
And that bohemianism itself, is that a kind of portent of cultural change? Is that something that feels a little more bobo and a little more meritocratic? It's already seeping into that scene. And would a real WASP have been that impressed by people sitting around at a party talking about Jane Austen. I don't know.
So before we take some questions, I want to ask you about one more theme of this. So I touched on it there, people who like books. So one of the ways in which these characters both feel like they're quite now and also feel like they come from a completely different world is the way Tom talks about books, because he talks about books, but he hasn't read them. And there's a little bit of that, having very strong opinions about Mansfield Park without having read it feels quite 2026, except the reason he has these opinions is he has read Lionel Trilling, which doesn't feel very 2026. So it's not like he's stopped reading books. As he says, he just doesn't want to read fiction because the classic male line, I can't get past the fact that it's all made up, sort of what middle-aged men always end up saying when they start reading war books and biographies. But you've been writing about, you've got a book coming out about the end of literacy, the end of reading. When you see this film, does it seem like a lost world of books, or do you get the whiff of the thing that is to come?
I guess the thing that feels lost is the role that books and culture in general play as a kind of class and status signifier, which I think probably has been, it feels sort of grubby to say it, but one of the great assets of English literature as a subject has been that people have felt in adult life they may be called upon to go to parties in which it'll be quite good to be able to have something to say about Jane Austen. And in some way, your kind of social and cultural self-respect or status may depend on having a kind of mastery of these various prestigious cultural artifacts. I don't think these things are prestigious in the same way. And I was watching the film and I was sort of thinking, what would they all be intensely talking about at a party nowadays? I think all the men would almost certainly be boring about AI, and everyone would be talking about what's your P-doom and, have you read the latest Gary Marcus and all this sort of stuff. Technology has supplanted culture as a kind of, both as a profitable industry, but I think also as a kind of socially prestigious artifact to hawk around at parties. So I guess it's less about are people reading, are people not reading? I guess it's more about the sort of prestige of literature in culture. The prestige of literature was a great asset for people reading it. And I think part of the problem, if people are reading less, which I think they are, I think is to do with that kind of loss of prestige. And nobody really thinks, God, I really probably should read Mansfield Park because someone might question me about that at a New York party. I don't think that's probably much of an anxiety nowadays.
Although, as you were saying that, the other thing that is striking about the film is that the thing that people talked about in the 70s, talked about in the 90s, talk about now is television. The other thing they would be talking about is box sets.
And it's TV is absent from that. Absent.
So TV only features in two respects: the log, the burning log, and they turn on the TV to watch Nick go to whatever that ball is, where he's there with the young cadet and the girl from Texas. So they either watch themselves on TV or they watch a burning log. And actually, TV is the thing that connects all of these eras. So, I taught for decades in Cambridge, and I was at a Cambridge college. And there's this sort of myth that in these high places of learning, the conversation must be sparkling. And people would say, when you all get together to have lunch or dinner, it must be amazing. The biologist talks to the historian and the ideas must really flow. And I would always say, in all of my 25 years, all anyone talks about is TV. The conversation would be, are you watching Succession or going back, whatever the equivalent was? And that's unrealistic, actually. So that's the one thing, it seems to me, that this group of people are really from the 19th century, because it is just books.
Yes. I mean, TV is such a contemporaneous medium. By its nature, TV is sort of obsessed with the present. And it's just hard to fit into that timeless film. I think it would be very hard to talk about television. It would place it so immediately. The books do offer a couple of chronological clues. The book about sex that Nick is showing at the party is published in 1971, but also is slightly timeless. It's the kind of book that's always appearing. There are always books like that are selling, and it could be from the 60s and it could be from the 90s. But yeah, there are no all the cultural artifacts are quite notably timeless. And I mean,
there's one scene where Charlie is standing in front of a bookcase that consists entirely of works by Winston Churchill.
Yes, I noticed that. And Tom has Spengler's Decline of the West on his bedside table. And I can never notice what the book Audrey is reading at the very end, but I'm sure that offers some kind of very witty, clever clue about her character.
It's a very naturalistically acted film, and some critics don't like it. It's been described as sort of clunking and amateurish in some ways in the way that they perform. I think the acting in it is brilliant, and I think it's completely convincing. And I was curious when I was watching it recently, to find out what happened to all of these amazing actors. What did they all go on and do? Because they seem like naturals, like screen naturals. And the answer is none of them went on to do anything, in that the few of them who did go on to have careers in movies almost exclusively have appeared in films directed by Whit Stillman. And I think he's called Edward Carpenter, who is the actor who plays Tom, who I think is completely brilliant in this film. It's a completely natural performance. So I went on the Metropolitan Wikipedia page to find out what happened to him. So it's quite an achievement, this. He does not have a Wikipedia page. You know, you could have a minor bit part in an obscure sitcom and you will have a Wikipedia page. He was the star of one of the great films of its time. So I tried to find out what happened to him, and it turns out, I think, unless it's a myth, because there's lots of online searches for him, that he became a pastor in Toronto and he renounced acting. And that feels of a piece with this film, that actually part of its charm is that they weren't actors. I mean, few of them went on to have successful careers as actors, and they are so convincing, partly because it feels like they're not acting. I mean, it may be too good to be true to put it like that, but I think the central performances are magnificent.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it sounds like this guy's life basically never stopped being a Whit Stillman film. He just, continued to act out his life as if he was being directed by Whit Stillman, doing vaguely eccentric comic things.
Just nobody's watching.
Nobody's watching
like
him.
A Whit Stillman film.
No, you can, yeah, exactly. No, you can stop now. You don't have to continue to be an eccentric, downwardly mobile Canadian pastor. But I totally agree about the performances, and I think probably because they do feel a bit untrained as actors. They have a kind of rawness, and I think the script is so ridiculously immaculate and so full of amazing lines. If you were to say them with like the hint of actorly flourish, it would all seem ridiculous and far too much. And I think the fact that they're able to seem like callow, raw youths who don't really know about life, while speaking some of the most sparkling dialogue that's ever been written for cinema, is a kind of amazing alchemy, and they could so easily have got that wrong. And if they were remotely more professional, you'd have just been like, why are these 18-year-olds talking like, Jane Austen and Samuel Johnson? But yeah, I think the kind of rawness and the slickness works very well, I think.
Thank you very much. That was a great film. I wondered if one of the genres you were missing out on there was theatre, because it occurred to me, Nick really seems like a sort of Oscar Wilde character. I think a lot of this dialogue, yes, it's very convincing that these people are talking like that, but they're also trying to be quite performative. And the sense of there not really being a world outside of this scene that is set in one or two apartment buildings, I guess, Nick's home. I wonder what you thought about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess to me, the sort of performativeness comes from the fact that when you're 18, you are putting on a performance and you are trying to persuade everyone that you're more impressive than you are, and you are trying to pretend that you've read Fourier and that you've read Mansfield Park when you haven't. I almost think because the acting is so raw and because the acting seems so undeveloped, it's quite anti-theatrical. Those lines could all be delivered with the kind of flourish that you might get at a performance of, an importance of being earnest, where all the actors are slightly in on the joke of how brilliant the dialogue is, but they're sort of speaking the dialogue almost as if they're not totally aware of how great it is. What do you think?
I mean, I think it's definitely the case that one of the reference points, and I think it's discussed briefly when they talk about Mansfield Park, is that Mansfield Park is a book about theatre. And Mansfield Park is a book in which the young characters put on a play, and then there is outrage because theatre is immoral. And if you get involved in theatrical performance, anything might happen. People might fall in love and the rest. And I think that is a reference point for this. But I think in the way that James said, it's a kind of inversion of that. These aren't people who are going to lose their morality by putting on a play. These are people for whom life is that kind of performance.
And it's also true that, as they're constantly saying, the girls are being put on display, they're doing their debutante balls, they're out on show, and they kind of are on a stage. It's a good point, because I guess they're out in the sort of stage of New York society being watched and being seen, but you never see that aspect of their lives. You're always seeing them. I mean, I guess there's a way in which those scenes feel like when you've come off stage and then you all kind of huddle behind, in your kind of dressing room or whatever before the next scene, you're always seeing them at the after parties or in the corners at parties. So the performance is going on somewhere else, but you see them behind the scenes, as it were, I think.
And I think part of the reason it takes place in 2 or 3 apartments is the reason it's not set in the 1970s.
Yeah, money. But I think the small budget has done wonders for that film. I think it works really well.
As someone in their 20s and watching this, I'm wondering, what do you make of this dilemma that's depicted in the film? This feeling that they're doomed to fail, even though on the outside it seems to us that they've got everything. It may seem melodramatic, and the film does call them out on that. But I believe the emotional intensity is rather real. And as you've mentioned in the talk, they're going to turn out fine. But I suppose in your 20s, there's always this time that just seems like, it's all falling apart. It's destined to fail. And surely you can do more than just talking to your friends about it. What's the solution here, I guess?
That's one for you, James.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I think so much of what seems sort of historically or sociologically off about the film has a kind of emotional truth. And I think everything you say about being in your 20s, the film captures so much of that through odd devices. And that feeling of being doomed is obviously, certainly true to my early 20s. And looking back, it wasn't all as completely disastrous as it seemed to you at the time. But I think that is part of what they're feeling, is like the uncertainty of being in your early 20s. But obviously characters like Charlie are probably overinterpreting that feeling of being in your early 20s as a sign of a wider sociological crisis.
I think one of the other interesting things about the film that we haven't really touched on, so they're obsessed with their parents, but there's also a theme of absent fathers. And Charlie says at one point, there's a myth that all our parents get divorced, they don't get divorced. But I think Nick says, but the fathers keep dying. And that to me also feels like it's from an earlier time, a sort of Mad Men world where their dads would be kind of hard drinking,
smoking,
hard smoking, Wall Street types who would drop dead at 55. That wouldn't be the story now. I mean, one of the differences between that, say, 70s world that Stillman grew up in and now is that, their parents live forever.
Yeah, my dad's doing ultra marathons and he's doing an Ironman, which is what the dads of this social class are probably doing now. But of course, this is before the rise of meritocracy, so they're all having enormously long lunches and not really doing that much work.
I actually lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in my early 20s. Lived there for many years, and there were 0 top hats and 0 debutante balls. So I think this is out of time for sure. My question about the film is, it seems to me, one note, it seems to me that it is only critical, it's only mocking of the UBs. Very funny, it's very effective at that, but do you see more depth than that to it? It's your favorite film, so...
Yeah, I totally do. I think what makes it so enchanting is that it's obviously not at all uncritically in love with that world, and it's not at all, look at all these marvelous posh people having a great time. The film is continuously probing them and mocking them. But I think it does sort of contain real affection for that world. Certainly in Charlie, in Nick, obviously loves that world. And I do think, I find the end of the film quite affecting. I think there's a sort of emotional depth that comes in gradually. I don't know. I think it might be one of those films that the more you watch it, the more deep it feels. And the sparkling surface is amazing and wonderful and witty. And that's what I loved when I first saw it. But I do think there's more going on underneath the surface. And I think the more you realize that the main character is Audrey, who in some ways, I think if there's ever any, and there are plenty of bad things said about WASPs, but if there was any, the good things that are said about the WASP class in hindsight is, the kind of moral concern, the sort of sense of social responsibility that people often say that kind of previous American aristocracy had, that the one that superseded it doesn't quite have. I think Audrey embodies some of those qualities. And I think when you kind of get that she, to me, is sort of the heart of the film, I think it feels like a deeper, less totally frothy, sparkly thing.
I also think it's genuinely affectionate about male friendship in the sense that there are
very well done as well. I think really well portrayed.
And there are 2 friendships that develop, one between Tom and Nick and one between Tom and Charlie in particular. I think that one could be almost from any film of that kind in which these 2 boys come together, they rub each other up the wrong way. And just those last 10 or 15 minutes where they start to appreciate some, but not all by any means, but some of each other's virtues is touching.
And the wonderful thing when in the back of the taxi and Tom says, you can tell being conciliatory towards Charlie that maybe he thinks Fourierism isn't all that it's cracked up to be. And that's a real olive branch that's been offered. Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think those male friendships in the film have that kind of really good quality of being unexpected but believable in the way that real life friendships are. They're kind of the Nick and the Tom friendship is a slightly odd couple and you wouldn't expect it, but it makes sense. And the Charlie and Tom have a sort of unexpected, but eventually you see it kind of friendship. And I think, like so many things in this film, so incredibly delicately, charmingly, deftly done, I think.
And when Nick says to Tom, I'm going to see my dad. I haven't seen him for a while. Don't know what my stepmother wants. But if I die, even if it looks like an accident, do you promise me there'll be an investigation? He completely sincerely says yes. That's the bit I like. He doesn't laugh. He doesn't smile. He says yes.
Yeah, and it's just sort of touching. You kind of believe that he would try.
No, exactly. You think he would doggedly, rather than become a pastor in Toronto, spend the next 30 years. And then he'd make a podcast, a true crime podcast about it.
I was wondering whether you think that the film ever becomes a bit smug, potentially. There's this sort of element of sort of wishful thinking, like Stillman sort of has this anachronistic world that he kind of wishes he was still living in. And I was interested that you said at the ICA it was the sort of normal people crowd, because I find that it's like more the sort of brideshead people who are really into Whit Stillman these days, and that it's wanting to laugh at a joke about Fourier and stuff like that, which gives it its appeal to people.
Were the people at the screening you were at the brideshead crowd? Hard to tell.
Yeah, I didn't look like that to me, but I could just be, self-deluding.
And everyone dresses the same these days. So how can you tell?
How can you tell?
Crowd?
It's funny. I mean, I can completely see why it appears smug. I really don't find it. I don't find it smug at all, and I think it's less laughing at jokes about Fourier and more laughing at the incompetence with which those jokes are told and the kind of ludicrous pretensions of the people trying to tell them. You know, as I was saying, Whit Stillman talks about how he felt one of the challenges of the film was to make that world not seem completely obnoxious to an audience. I feel like he succeeds, but I mean, I'm obviously very inclined to like this film, and I can see why it might not work for everyone. Did you think it was smug?
No, some of the characters are smug, but I didn't think it was smug. And I think it gets less smug as it goes along. One of my favourite bits is when they're trying to rent a car and the various ways in which they fail. But then at one point, Charlie says, this is how the decline starts. Incompetence at basic tasks leads to the decline and fall of a whole class. And I find that relatable.
I was hoping to maybe get you guys to talk a little bit about like the crisis of masculinity that I identified as pretty central to the film. I mean, we've got the young female characters who at the start are very imprisoned by the gender norms of having escorts and having to be seen and having to be entertained by these guys. And I noticed that all 4 of them or 5 of them are able to sort of branch out and get new boyfriends, have new friends, go to different social events around the city. Whereas the guys kind of feel like, oh, we're being left behind here. And then there's this weird like damsel in distress rescue thing at the end as well, even though they had no reason to believe that there would be a damsel in distress. I think that would really make the film resonate with audiences today, especially with the whole masculinity thing. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really perceptive. And it is true that the film starts with the male characters seeming quite patronizing about the female characters and talking about how exposed they are and how this is a difficult time for them, and there aren't enough male escorts to go around because men don't want to go to debutante balls anymore. But as you say, by the end, the men are all kind of useless, and the women have gone off with Rick von Sloneker, potentially going to France.
The record producer who suddenly comes in at the end. He's a glimpse of another world.
Yes, exactly. And there's a whole other world of masculinity, which it seems like it's going to completely wipe them out because they're utterly useless and going around in their stupid ties and talking about Fourier. And then actually you realise there are Rick von Slonekers and record producers out there who are just going to really doom them, I think, in their kind of attempts to acquire girlfriends.
And there's that exchange between Nick and Charlie where Charlie admits that if by Gaga you mean, do I like her? Yes, I like her. And Nick says, why don't you do something about it? And he says, by do something about it, what do you mean? Declare myself? As though those were the options, right? You could make an 18th century style declaration.
Exactly. And in a way,
or keep quiet forever.
And in a way, that the men are the characters who are most living in that Jane Austen world. I think you feel like the women are producing the Jane Austen atmosphere, and you actually realise the ones who care most about the social rules and the ones who are policing them most carefully are the male characters. And eventually, as you say, by the end of the film, the women have sort of disappeared, and the carefully constructed social world in which you absurdly believe that you have to declare yourself is evaporated, the kind of world they're trying to maintain.
And I take that scene where he picks that book off the shelf called Girls and Sex or something, and he reads the back of it, and it includes this line, which is, it's much harder for girls because they grow up much later, they mature much later, in a film in which the girls have matured a lot quicker than the boys.
Yes, it's a good point. And yes, exactly. I think that's totally right.
So you mentioned a lot about how there are kind of novelistic aspects of the film, and the dialogue is very novelistic. Do you think it's kind of a film that really wants to be a novel or wishes that it was a novel? And what is lost or gained by it being a film rather than a novel?
So I think it is true, isn't it, that Whit Stillman has written novelized versions of his movies, but not this one, I think.
No, I don't think so. I think you're completely correct. The Polly Perkins monologue that Nick delivers is 5 pages long, which is, like, I think unheard of for a film script. And I think it is. I mean, if you were to make a criticism of whether it works or not, I think the sheer density of dialogue maybe doesn't quite work. That I'm, seeing it for however many times I've seen it now, and I'm still like, oh God, I didn't get that amazing joke, which I would have got when I was reading it. I mean, the thing that you miss in a film that you get in a novel, and especially in a Jane Austen novel, is interiority. And, so much of the comedy of Jane Austen is the way that she's sort of dancing you in and outside of characters' heads, and all their dialogue is coming, simultaneously with your awareness of what they're thinking on the inside, which she can tell you quite explicitly. And, she's pioneering free and direct discourse, and all the sort of dialogue and psychology interplay is handled so subtly, and directors are stuck in the exterior world. But I think insofar as a film director has to struggle with the problem of getting inside characters' heads, I think that film does it amazingly well. And I think it's partly to do with the rawness of the actors. They have that kind of youthful rawness. And when in that long Polly Perkins monologue that Nick delivers, what you're seeing is all the characters' faces and all their reactions to the story. And you're kind of being taken inside everybody's head as they listen to this long speech. And that feels kind of very, very cleverly novelistic to me.
And you were saying it reminds you a bit of Sally Rooney. But so Sally Rooney, the novels contain sequences of dialogue that are very sharp and funny, and there's almost nothing but dialogue in them. Sally Rooney on the screen, so Normal People, for instance, one of the reasons why I didn't like it, one of the reasons I found it dull, is the dialogue sparkle had gone.
Whit Stillman should have directed it.
Whit Stillman should have directed it. But also this is a sign, I think, that actually the dialogue is the thing. You can imagine a novel in which that dialogue was central to it, but this pares it right down to the dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine reading the script of Metropolitan, having a great time, almost as good a time as watching the film, I think, because you'd get every single joke.
So Whit Stillman is apparently very cross that he hasn't made more films, so maybe the pitch should be he should direct Intimates.
The ultimate crossover event. I mean, you have to imagine it would go disastrously wrong, especially seeing as he seems like quite a disillusioned character and probably not politically in sympathy with Sally Rooney, unless they could bond over their shared loathing of Trump. Maybe it'll happen.
But if it happens, you heard it here first.
Yeah, and I'd be very happy about it.
We would love to see you at the next film in our season at the Regent Street Cinema, and it's coming up soon. It is on Friday, the 17th of April. It's a very different film. It's a film of ideas too, I promise you, but in a different way. It's South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut. Released in 1999, weirdly prophetic. And I'm going to be talking to the former film director, now leading campaigner against the power of the technology companies, Biban Kidron, who was our guide before to Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, about South Park. Do join us. You know how to get the tickets. Just click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. Next time, I'm starting a new series. I'm going to be talking about George Orwell, and I'm going to be talking about George Orwell's experiences of the Second World War. Orwell, during the war, wrote Animal Farm, his masterpiece, but he also kept a diary and was a prolific letter writer and journalist. And he was commenting in real time on the events of the central event of the 20th century. And what is so interesting about George Orwell during the Second World War is that he saw things that other people didn't see. He was prophetic, and he got almost everything wrong. That's next time, Orwell's War. This has been Past, Present, Future.